afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's really nice to be back here again at the ICD with all of you. Also, thank you for allocating generously 30 minutes to me in my speech. I will not use all of that time to lecture you. I'll lecture you just a little. But then I would like to leave some space for discussion and maybe some questions and answers. I think that would be much more enriching than just me talking so that you don't fall asleep. But I would like to lay out a bit of a context so that we can have an informed discussion later on. And for that, I will reach back far in history so that we can understand a little bit where we are today in terms of the Roma issues in Europe. So the Roma, commonly known as Gypsies, which, by the way, we consider an ethnic slur, is an ethnic minority. We like to think of ourselves rather as a transnational diaspora or a non-territorial nation. And as a people, we have over a millennium of history. Based on the most reliable linguistic and genetic researches, we now know that the Roma started their travel from northern part of India around the year 1000, and then engaged in this travel towards towards Western Europe. It's by the end of 15th century, Roma were present virtually in all countries of the continent. Initially, the Roma were seen with a degree of curiosity and interest when they reached Europe. They were often presenting themselves as pilgrims who were traveling to Rome or that had some type of penance. They many times also received letters of safe conduct which allowed them entry and passage through different countries. This, however, soon ended, and it was replaced by a drastically different attitude towards the Roma. The Roma began to be seen as pagans, as barbarians, as strangers, as unwanted guests, without morality, which had an unknown, strange language and different traditions and were visibly different from the local population that they passed through. And gradually, Roma began to be pushed to the social margins, literally. So by the late 15th century, anti-Roma laws were practiced virtually everywhere in Europe, from persecutions to expulsions to assimilation, forced labor, and forced imprisonment. So to give you some examples, in Spain, anti-Roma laws were imposed by the end of 15th century in the times of Inquisition and the rules of the Catholic kings, the Catholic monarchs, and it was based on expulsions and mass imprisonment and forced labor. Also, it was forbidden to speak the language Romanes. It was forbidden to practice any type of Roma traditions under the threat of hanging. Also, the Roma were forcibly expulsed even across the seas. So it is now documented that the Roma traveled to the then newly discovered America already in the third travel of Christopher Colon. On the other hand, in UK, Switzerland, Sweden, and Denmark, many others, there were laws that allowed to kill any Roma found in the territory. In Germany, killing Roma was not a crime, was not considered a crime, and the so-called gypsy hunting began and was very popular in those times. In territories of Romania and Moldova, Roma were enslaved since the middle of 14th century. Slavery which lasted in Europe to late 19th century, something that many of us don't really know. And the approaches and attitudes that were shaped back then, already in the Middle Ages, also shaped the way we see Roma today. So more importantly also, this treatment and this centuries-long legacy of slavery, of imprisonment and expulsion has also very, very tangible consequences for the situation of Roma communities at the present moment. Also, what's important is that over the centuries of this persecution, Antigypsyism was formed. Antigypsyism is a term that means a historically rooted and socially stabilized phenomenon of certain fear and hatred towards the Roma people, or all those that may be associated with the Gypsies. At the root of anti-Gypsyism, we have a certain dehumanization of Roma, who are seen or perceived as worse or visibly different and worse category of the people. And the whole imagery associated with the Gypsies, of the stereotypes that you might imagine, whether they are thieves or they steal children or they lie, all of these things have also been shaped already in the Middle Ages. Anti-Gypsyism as an ideology and a practice, a social practice, reached its apogeum, its peak during the times of the Second World War, during as much as half of the population of European Roma were murdered In some countries, as much as 90% of Roma were assassinated, as for example in Austria. So Roma, alongside of Jews, were subject to a racial policy of total extermination. However, in the context of post-war, there was no reparations for Roma victims. There was not one Roma witness during Nuremberg trials. And also this moral dimension of treating Roma as victims of the Holocaust in the same capacity as the Jewish population was missing. In fact, it was not until the middle of the 80s that the German government actually recognized its responsibility for the Roma Holocaust. This, of course, as you can imagine, has very deep consequences for the community itself. It meant the complete devastation of the Roma community, of its families, of social structures. Also, all the resources, collective resources were lost and had to kind of start over, but without the status of victims that should be treated with a certain degree of rehabilitation after the war. So with this very quick overview, we reached the point of today. The Roma are the biggest ethnic minority in Europe, reaching between 10 to 12 million people. That's a bigger population than over half of the EU member states. Then the status of Roma, of course, is also visibly worse than that of majority population in terms of socioeconomic standing, extreme poverty, existing discrimination and marginalization. Also, what's important to say here is that Roma, we are a very diverse community, which includes or encompasses diverse nationalities, religion affiliations, traditions and rituals or practices. So we're not a homogeneous community. The plight of Roma, which is a consequence of the centuries-long discrimination throughout Europe, required collective responses. So it was already during the context of in the post-war, and especially raised by the Roma leaders, that it's very necessary to create collective responses to the situation of Roma. This had different dimensions, from socio-economic situation to humanitarian aid to also conflict prevention and peace building. I will explain this in a little moment. What's important in this context that as a transnational diaspora, which does not have a state that represents themselves, that represents the Roma, intergovernmental organizations were a natural reference point for the Roma and for Roma political leaders. In this process, it was already in the 70s that many Roma leaders in different countries tried to raise attention and generate a sense of urgency among governments and intergovernmental organizations, most notably among the UN, but it was not until the 90s that this process took bigger impetus. That's because we need to take into consideration a certain context, the background in Europe of the decade of the 90s. On the one hand, we have the process of reunification of Europe. Notably, the vast majority of Roma live in the Soviet bloc. So when the Soviet Union disintegrated, it was also in this process of reunification that the question of Roma became more visible. On the other hand, there was also the context of the Balkan Wars. It was in the context of Balkan Wars and of modern Europe that it was seen that ethnic and cultural difference can lead to serious armed conflict. And it was then seen that also Roma were among the principal victims of this conflict of all sides during the war. So it also raised awareness about the importance of actually creating frameworks for minority treatment and minority protection. So over time, there was, in this process, in the political process on the international level, it was seen that the Roma as a community needs special treatment. And gradually, this sui generis status of Roma emerged. First, in the context of the OSCE, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, this organization was the first one actually to start acting in a more coordinated manner with regards to Roma. This, again, the context of Balkan War, the OSCE had the competency of building and protecting the status of peace among its member states. So it was seen that in the aftermath of the war, it's really important to create mechanisms of protection and minority rights protection and protection of human rights. And it was already in 1994 that the OSCE created a contact point for Roma and Sinti issues that meant to coordinate these activities among the member states. Then it was also the Council of Europe, a natural player, which also had a lot of important role in shaping Roma policies or the European management of the Roma population in Europe. Of course, the Council of Europe has the scope of competencies in terms of minority treatment. So it's important to raise here to mention here the Minority Framework Convention of the 1995, which also created a very important framework, legal framework for the protection of Roma, and also the Convention on Languages and Minority Language Protection, which also mentioned Romanes language. Again, it was also in the mid-90s that the special expert group on Roma was created in the Council of Europe, which also meant to shape these policies and try to create coordinated responses to dealing with Roma. But of course, as you can imagine, it was the European Union that created the biggest impact with regards to Roma. This again, it's important to mention a certain background why the EU played such a role. And why it was in the 90s that this started to happen. So on the one hand, there was a phenomenon of increased presence of Roma refugees and asylum seekers in many of the Western European countries. This, again, a consequence of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, but also of the Balkan Wars, in which the Roma migrants, Roma refugees were starting to be increasingly more visible in many of the countries of the Western Europe. And then, of course, there was the perspective of the EU enlargement. So as I mentioned, the vast majority of Roma live in the Central and Eastern Europe, the candidate countries. So it was then that the EU devised the so-called Copenhagen criteria. Copenhagen criteria are those mechanisms of political conditionalities imposed on member states that guarantee that those who join, the new members who will join the EU, will be at the same level, not only in terms of economic situation, but also in terms of certain political and institutional standards. The Copenhagen criteria included specific recommendations of minority rights protection and aimed at improving the situation of Roma citizens, the future citizens of the EU. What's important to mention here, however, is that the Copenhagen criteria were new mechanisms that were created for the EU enlargements of the Central and Eastern Europe. So they applied to the new candidates, to the new future member states, but they did not apply to those countries that were already member states, so the predominantly Western European countries. So then we have the 2004 enlargement, so the 10 countries with a vast population of Roma, and then especially 2007 enlargement of Bulgaria and Romania, where the big sizable population of Roma live. So suddenly with these two enlargements, the item of foreign affairs policy of the EU started to become an item of the internal policy, in which those Roma communities are now becoming also citizens of the EU with the same rights and the same status. So it was already very soon after the 2007 enlargement wave that the EU or institutions started to discuss a need for a collective approach towards Roma. There was a discussion on a common EU policy already in 2007-2008. And then to add to this whole picture, we have 2008 and Italy of Berlusconi, who imposes the state of emergency of the nomad invasion, as it was called by Berlusconi, which heated very much the atmosphere. And the very similar attitudes in France of Sarkozy, who also began the process of mass expulsions and deportations of EU citizens who happened also to be Roma, something that was completely against the EU priorities and EU non-discrimination directives, and was also raised by the DG Commissioner back then, Viviane Reding. It created a certain impetus and a process of uncomfortable situation in terms of the EU coordination, because you have a conflict between Eastern and Western countries, you have extreme breaching of EU law. So it increasingly became visible that it's absolutely necessary to have a policy that targets the situation of Roma and can decrease maybe this pull and push factors between East and West. So it was in 2011 that the EU Roma framework for Roma inclusion was created. And this brings me to the central point of this short lecture. The EU Roma framework for Roma inclusion, which was passed in 2011, is a common framework, a common policy, which obliges all member states of the EU to create a strategy for Roma inclusion, a national strategy, which is based on 4 priority areas: housing, health, education, and employment. This was a major development. This was the first time that the Roma issue reached such a high level of EU agenda, political agenda and discussion. It was also an achievement at that time we as Roma activists and leaders, we thought that this is a major achievement that will create a breakthrough for the Roma and will create increasing impact. That's because the strategies had to be based on a certain analysis of the situation of the national minority groups in each country, and had to devise mechanisms and also provide investment to improve those areas. Each country is obliged to report to the European Commission on the progress they're made and the investment that is made, and it also includes a very targeted approach to actually target Roma and benefit the Roma. So seemingly back in 2011 we thought that this is going to be the breakthrough. Now that we are in 2018, we see that this was not a solution, and there were some problems that were already identified back then, and now we're seeing them quite with much more clarity. So on the one hand, one problem that was very clearly upfront identifiable in this sense is that there was a one framework, a one strategy that had to be translated into very diverse policy approaches in very different national contexts. So there are countries in which Roma are recognized as an ethnic minority, for example, Poland, country where I come from. This is very important because that means that the Roma population have a legal framework of protection which already obliges the countries to provide certain assistance because these people are considered an ethnic minority. That's very important. But then there are also countries which do have frameworks of nationality, of minorities and minorities protection, but do not recognize Roma as belonging to those groups. So for example, in Italy, there are 14 national minorities recognized, but Roma are not among those. So they lack this legal protection and the framework of minority status. Then, of course, there are also countries that recognize their own national Roma minorities, but they don't recognize those who are newcomers. That's an example of Germany, in which the national, the Sinto community is considered a national autochthonous minority, but there have been also Central and Eastern European Roma or Balkan Roma who also have been residing in this country for at least 2 or 3 decades, but they have not the status of a minority recognition. And then, of course, there are countries that deny existence of ethnic difference altogether. So, for example, France. Despite the fact that evidently France is a very multicultural country, by law, they are only citizens and they are equal citizens, so therefore they deny existence of ethnic difference, which also limits the possibilities of action and for policy making. So this creates a very confusing scope for the one common policy on the EU level in which the domestic legal or constitutional frameworks do not allow to have similar action, which of course results, for example, in lack of ethnic data. So in France, for example, we cannot measure existence of Roma, we cannot measure discrimination against Roma, we cannot measure their status because theoretically there is no ethnic difference. Then again, we don't, there are many countries like in Spain, for example, which when you cannot collect ethnic data, this is unconstitutional, which also means we cannot measure impact or design policies that actually can apply to specific situations of those communities. So that's one major problem. Then another major problem of the very design of the framework, and we are now seeing very tangibly its consequences, is the fact that the EU Roma framework did not focus on or did not have a dimension of discrimination and anti-Gypsyism. So Roma, on paper, are citizens of the countries where they live, which provides them with a certain scope of laws and rights. The fact is, however, that they lack access to equal rights, which then creates many other consequences. So even if they are citizens, their rights as citizens are not respected to the same level as other non-Roma citizens, for example. And there is a growing consensus that a main obstacle to achieving any substantial progress in this regard in terms of Roma integration is actually the existence of anti-Gypsyism. The growing consensus already started to be translated into legal documents. So in 2015, the European Parliament passed a resolution which acknowledges existence of anti-Gypsyism in Europe and recommends taking action to challenge this. So the fact that we have anti-Gypsyism creates very many obstacles to implementation. So for example, even if a strategy is written on paper, it is many times not implemented locally. Even if it's attempted to be implemented by policymakers, whether at the regional, local, or national level, there's also many times obstacles in implementation on the level of specific actions. So for example, if there is an investment to create a project on Roma housing, in a certain country, and there's political will, there's financial investment, there's a legal framework for doing it, there may be responses of the local population who are meant to be neighbors of that Roma housing project who protest and block completely the implementation. This happens in many different aspects, which creates a tangible obstacle to actually being able to put the commitments included in the strategy and put them into practice. Then also there is a problem of the fact that the investment dedicated to Roma inclusion are not well allocated. So what research is showing now that the fact that there was a European Roma policy created with money allocated to it also attracted many other actors to the field. So we have a number of pro-Roma or charities organizations without any experience or connections to the communities, but who are very competitive in writing grants, for example, who become actors who implement. But many times these actions are not designed in a way that can really achieve a substantial progress. Also, what we see from research is that the majority of investment goes into salaries. So they very rarely actually reach directly the communities. In some countries, as much as 85% of allocated funds for Roma are consumed by staff. So you can see that the investment is not really reaching the population. And then many times what is happening also is that, for example, we have a square of a town reformed based on the Roma strategy because there are also Roma living in this locality. So we can just put this to make a new fountain on the square because, of course, Roma also live here. So we have also seen many of this phenomenon. And this has very important consequences in terms of accountability. Because despite the investment that's proved, the common perception is that the Roma don't want to integrate. That's very difficult because the money is not managed by the Roma, so that has to be clear. The Roma stakeholders, actors, whether are NGOs or political leaders, they have no decision-making power on how the implementation goes and where the money is invested. There's also the problem that a creation of a specific targeted policy and sort of affirmative discrimination, affirmative action policies, are many times fueling anti-Roma sentiments. So we see that socially, sometimes there is a lot of reaction on the local level that why are the Roma, the undeserving Roma, receiving money to reform their houses or receiving scholarships for school, while we are citizens, we do not. So this is a big problem. And if we now see the status of 2018 today, in the Europe that we are living today, and the lack of impact, what we can see that beside the fact that there is a EU-Roma framework, which is one common strategy for treating Roma at the European level, there is lack of impact, but also apart from lack of impact, the tangible result for the community themselves, we see now that in some cases the situation got even worse. So a few aspects contributed to this. One is the question of financial crisis. So the financial crisis and its austerity measures hit very hard in on the vast majority of European countries. So also investing into a Roma disadvantaged population who is not seen very favorably by the society, majority of society, fueled anti-Roma sentiments. So while the Roma were hated and discriminated against in 2005, now they are discriminated and hated even more than they were 10 years ago. Something that we can measure with existing polls and research. Then, of course, we have the context of shifting European sentiments, the growing wave of far right in Europe and the growing radicalization of European societies, the growing xenophobia and nationalism. This, of course, hits very hard and impacts very directly into the Roma population. Of course, the anti-Roma, in terms of elections, for example, an electoral process in Europe, the Roma are treated as scapegoats many times. So we see that the anti-Roma sentiments are many times used for gaining votes. And actually you can see that in some countries in current atmosphere, in many countries, whether it's Italy or Czech Republic, we see that politicians who actually engage with this anti-Roma discourse gain votes. So this is also reflecting kind of the temperature of the European societies today. We also see that Roma are increasingly victims of hate speech not only in the media or on the streets, but especially in the context of political discourse. So now we see that this anti-Roma sentiment saying that the Roma are scums or of the society, or they are unwilling, or they are dirty, or whatever unacceptable statements are now only present not on the very far right spectrum of the political scene, which was the case around 5 years ago. Now we see that this type of speech has proliferated also among the mainstream parties and basically on the entire spectrum of the political scene, which also shows how the situation at the level of acceptance of difference has gotten worse. And of course, Roma are also targets of far-right movements. So whether it's paramilitary groups, whether it's the far-right marches, Roma are among the principal victims of, or principal targets of this. And also, to this context, what's important to underline is that the refugee crisis made all of this even worse. So the whole kind of backlash that we're seeing now that you talked about in your speech about the multiculturalism, we can see that the Roma are among those who are most commonly employed as example of the cost of multiculturalism, of the lack of success of this multiculturalist project. So in this sense, when we kind of try to analyze the situation of where are we now and where we're going, we often ask ourselves, why did the EU Roma strategy not generate change? Why was it not enough? If there is a specific targeted approach which obliges all the countries to have a strategy, a policy, and to have money to actually invest in those changes. And we believe that ultimately it's about anti-Gypsyism, and it's about existing racial hatred towards difference in general, and towards Roma in particular. So of course this has an individual dimension, so it's also on the level of existing stereotypes, of prejudice, of acts, of individual acts of racism or hate speech or hate crime, of course. But what's more worrisome is that there is an institutional dimension to this. So there is an apartheid-like system which sustains and contributes to the current situation. It's difficult to believe, but even today we have, in the context of the EU, we have school segregation in which the Roma are not accessing schools in the same spaces, or in which we have classes in which Roma of different ages are being taught instead of being integrated into a special system. You have a system of integrating Roma into special schooling as well, which also happens today in many European countries. We have expulsions and deportations of EU citizens from one country to the others. France is the most visible example of this practice, but it happens in many other countries as well. There are also Roma citizens in European member states' territories who are undocumented or stateless, which is also quite difficult to understand, that we have the EU populations, whole communities who are completely stateless, they have no documentation at all, which also, of course, impacts in their rights as citizens. There are cases of forced sterilization in many countries. Also, the most recent in the Czech Republic in 2007. This practice has been taking place for the past 3 or 4 decades, but it's very shocking that it still was happening some years ago in the context of EU member states. So we believe that in a system in which we have individual and institutional levels of discrimination, which sustain a system in which a certain sector of population is completely excluded and pushed to the margins, there is a need to shift focus. And ultimately, it's about images and narratives of understanding of belonging, of citizenship, and of identities. I think in the context of Roma specifically, but I think more broadly, it's about how we perceive ourselves as citizens and as nations. So something that has been also recurring during this few hours of discussion is that diversity is a natural fact of life. It has been part of Europe for centuries. It's not something that we should challenge, it's something that we should accept as a norm. That we should start seeing diversity as added value to our societies, as something that's enriching. This means that we need to open up the frames of belonging and the frame of national identities, because multiculturalism will not go away. It's going to be increasing. We see that from all the possible statues and trends. So this is something that really needs to be understood and accepted. And we believe at ERIAC that it's necessary to create new images and new narratives about diversity, and we work specifically in the context of Roma. So just a few words about ERIAC, the European Roma Institute for Arts and Culture, is a joint initiative of the Open Society Foundations, the Council of Europe, and the leaders, and the initiative of Roma leaders, the Alliance for European Roma Institute. And we work to use arts, culture, media, and education as tools to challenge stereotypes about Roma and create new narratives about who we are. We work with the premise that there will be no social inclusion without cultural inclusion. This reflects deeply Nancy Fraser's research on Nancy Fraser's theories on social justice. She says that social justice requires not only redistribution, which means investment in certain sectors of population, but also recognition. So in this sense, we really need to think about how we open up our identities and open up our imagination about who we are really as nations, as societies. Because we work, ERIAC works with the Roma population predominantly, but we are of course not the only segment of population in contemporary Europe which experiences this type of hate and this type of rejection and this types of discrimination. And as we witness the situation in Europe today, it's increasingly necessary to unite those voices and create a wave of a counter-narrative to the radicalization and the increasing xenophobia and nationalism that we see in Europe today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I think that Anna will be happy to reply. So, yes, please.
Thank you very much for the overview from the historical point and for the current situation and also this transgeographical of all the situation of the Roma community. In your opinion, like, this is how it is the status quo. But what can be done, like, from the Roma community itself and also from whoever is in favor of multiculturalism and in favor that, yeah, multicultural Europe and the multicultural in general is something that adds value and enrich people and enrich experiences. And a lot of studies has to be, I think, done in the benefits, economic and social and artistic and cultural of multiculturalism, because everybody talks about how much we spend money to include people, but nobody talks about how much we benefit also from this multi-diversity of restaurants and artistic places and all that kind of things that really brings a lot to the creativity and the development of places. And to go back to my question, or maybe it's not specifically for you, but in your opinion, how can we start to do something against all what you talked about? How can we join forces, and where do you see the relation and the link between the Roma community and whoever also wants to support the Roma community in that regard?
Thank you. This is a very important series of questions, and I think it could go for another conference entirely. But maybe I can chip in with a few things. Many of us tend to be quite skeptical and pessimistic increasingly, because we've seen that the situations year by year gets worse. And unfortunately, I think it might get a little worse before it gets better. And I think there are two things that are very necessary here. One, I think, is the scope of legality. So we need laws, and we need laws that can be enforced or enforceable. What we're seeing now, for example, in the context of European Union, we have non-discrimination laws. We have positive discrimination practices, maybe not necessarily as directive, but through strategies, for example, like this one. There is also a strategy on fighting anti-Semitism and fighting Islamophobia in Europe, for example. The problem now that we face is that the European Union lacks teeth. All the other intergovernmental organizations which create legal frameworks for minority rights protection, for example, or for non-discrimination, have non-binding character. So even if an organization might join or sign up under some convention, that necessarily creates legal tools to actually be able to enforce that. And I think here it's a question of reflecting on how we can create a system of legality which can be enforceable. I'm a bit skeptical because in the context of EU, it's member states who decide, and member states becoming increasingly fascist and increasingly on the far right spectrum. So it's very improbable that very soon they will change their attitude. But I think laws are very important. And I think that the other part of it, so there should be like this reactive scope in which we react against these negative things, but also there should be a proactive scope of action which should be based on educating societies. And I think educating majorities. I think it's really about creating new narratives, new stories, new framings of what we're doing, because everywhere we look, we actually see a securitization discourse with regards to immigration, for example. So instead of acknowledging the obvious, European societies are getting older. We have a demographic gap. We cannot sustain this level of life without actually having immigrants coming to Europe. I mean, a completely understandable thing. We can calculate the cost of non-integration through World Bank research or any other think tank research, for example. We have evidence, but the narratives that are created and that are circulated, that are disseminated through the media, in research, and especially in public and political discussions, is that of threat, of that of a security threat to our well-being. So I think there will be no change unless we create robust and very assertive discourses and alternative narratives, and we disseminate them widely, because we have evidences that can support those claims. So it's not only based on values that we share. I think it's also based on certain calculation. So there is a socioeconomic dimension to this as well. And I think what's here also very worrisome for me is this demise of political correctness. So there is, while a few years ago still there were certain things that you would not be able to say. Being a politician, for example, you would pay a political price if you'd say certain things, in next elections. Now we are in this kind of discourse that it's okay to be racist, it's okay to be frank and to be honest and just say that I think that this is really not working and I think that all gypsies are pigs or something. And you have a Bulgarian Minister of Health who said exactly that. This is a really serious problem. And I think that it's not about segmenting ourselves more, about, this is the rights of the Roma, this is, how we counter Islamophobia. I think, of course, each of those separately are super important, but I think we will not reach any momentum unless we join forces and we unite, because I think half of Europe is on the right, but I think the other half is still on the other side. So we have to find ways of coming together.
Thank you. I think we have time maybe for one more question, or if you don't have any question, we can move on. Okay. So thank you very much. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you.